April 14, 1834, Millfield Plantation, Georgia. A Sunday morning that began with hymns and prayers would end with blood soaked into the wooden floors of a country chapel. Martha Cooper, 31 years old, mother of 3, field hand turned house servant, stood over the bodies of 6 white men who had tormented her people for years. 6 overseers, 6 demons dressed in Sunday clothes, 6 men who believed their whips gave them the right to play God with human lives. All dead by the hands of a woman who had finally said enough. The iron poker she clutched was still warm from the chapel's fireplace, still dripping with the evidence of her rage. What had begun as another forced Sunday service, another hour of listening to white preachers speak of obedience and divine order, had become Martha's day of judgment, her day of reckoning. The congregation sat frozen in their pews, slaves and masters alike, staring at the carnage that had erupted in less than 10 minutes. Martha Cooper had done what none of them had dared to dream. She had turned the house of God into a battlefield, and she had won. This is the true story of Martha Cooper, the woman who proved that even the meekest lamb can become a lion when pushed too far. Before we continue with this incredible story, drop a comment telling us what you think about Martha's actions, and don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more untold stories of resistance and rebellion. The morning started like every other Sunday at Millfield Plantation. The sun rose slow and golden over 3,000 acres of cotton and corn, painting the fields in shades of amber and green. The great house stood proud on its hill, white columns gleaming in the early light, while down in the quarters, nearly 200 enslaved souls prepared for another day of forced worship. Martha Cooper woke before dawn, as she had every day, for the past 15 years. Her small cabin was crowded with bodies. Her 3 children, aged 8, 12, and 14, slept on straw mattresses she had sewn herself. Her mother, Beulah, now 63 and bent with arthritis, lay on the single bed Martha had given up years ago. The cabin was barely 12 feet square, with walls that let in winter cold and summer heat with equal cruelty. A single window, no bigger than a book, provided the only natural light. The floor was packed dirt, swept clean every evening but impossible to keep truly clean. This was home, the only home Martha's children had ever known. Martha dressed quietly in the pre-dawn darkness. Her Sunday dress was her only good clothing, a faded blue cotton that had once belonged to the master's daughter. It had been passed down through 3 generations of house servants before reaching Martha, patches upon patches holding it together like a prayer. She looked at her sleeping children and felt the familiar weight in her chest. James, her eldest, was already showing signs of the anger that lived in all the men on the plantation. Sarah, her middle child, had her grandmother's gentle spirit, but was beginning to understand the fate that awaited her as a woman in bondage. Little Thomas, only 8, still had some innocence left, still believed his mama could protect him from the world outside their cabin door. But Martha knew better. She had seen too much, lost too much, endured too much to believe in protection anymore. She had learned that in this world, the only safety came from being too dangerous to attack, too fierce to break, too ready to die to be easily killed. Outside, the plantation bell began to ring, calling the slaves to morning assembly. Every Sunday, the same ritual. Line up in the yard, heads down, hands clasped, while the overseers counted bodies and checked for signs of rebellion or escape attempts. Then, the forced march to the chapel, where they would sit in segregated pews and listen to sermons about accepting their place in God's grand design. Martha had been attending these services for 15 years, ever since Master Whitfield had decided that Christian slaves were more obedient slaves. She had sat through hundreds of sermons about servants obeying their masters, about the curse of Ham, about finding joy in suffering. She had watched her people nod and say amen to their own oppression, too beaten down to recognize the blasphemy being preached in God's name. But something had changed in Martha over the past months. The breaking point had come 3 weeks earlier, on the day they sold her son James to a plantation in Mississippi. No warning, no chance to say goodbye. She had come back from the fields to find him gone, chained to a wagon with 5 other young men, heading west toward a fate she could not imagine and could not prevent. The master's explanation had been simple, practical, cruel. James was getting too old, too strong, too likely to cause trouble. Better to sell him while he still had value, before he became a problem that required solving with rope and fire. Martha had begged, pleaded, offered to work double shifts, to give up her food rations, to do anything if they would bring her boy back. The overseer had laughed at her tears, had told her she should be grateful they hadn't sold all 3 of her children, had reminded her that slaves didn't have families, just breeding arrangements that served the master's financial interests. That night, alone in her cabin with her 2 remaining children, Martha had felt something die inside her chest. Not her heart, that was already broken beyond repair. Something else. Something that had kept her human in an inhuman world. Hope, maybe. Or fear. Or the last remnants of the woman she had been before this place had tried to turn her into property. What remained was something harder, colder, more dangerous. What remained was a woman with nothing left to lose and everything to avenge. Martha had been born free, in a small town in Pennsylvania, to parents who had escaped slavery and built a new life in the North. Her first 8 years had been filled with laughter, learning, love. She had attended school, learned to read and write, played with children of all colors without understanding why some people thought that was wrong. Then came the night the slave catchers arrived, men with dogs and chains and legal papers that said Martha and her parents were property, runaways who needed to be returned to their rightful owner in Georgia. Her parents' protests, their proof of freedom, their testimonials from white neighbors, none of it mattered when faced with men who made their living hunting human beings. The journey south had been a nightmare of wagon beds and auction blocks, of families torn apart and dreams destroyed. Martha had watched her father disappear into a crowd of buyers in Charleston, had seen her mother sold to a rice plantation in South Carolina, had found herself alone at age 8, standing on a platform while white men examined her teeth, and felt her muscles like she was livestock. Master Whitfield had bought her for $50, a bargain for a young girl who could be trained for housework. The early years had been a blur of kitchen duties, laundry, cleaning, learning to be invisible while adults discussed the business of human bondage around the dinner table. But Martha never forgot her first 8 years of freedom. Never stopped reading, though she hid the skill carefully. Never stopped writing, using charcoal on scraps of wood to practice letters in the darkness of her cabin. Never stopped believing that somewhere beyond the cotton fields and the whipping posts and the master's house, there was still a world where people like her could be truly human. As she grew older, Martha began to understand the full horror of her situation. She learned about breeding, about the ways enslaved women were forced to bear children to increase their master's wealth. She discovered that her body was not her own, that pregnancy was not a choice but an economic calculation made by men who saw her womb as just another source of profit. When she turned 16, Master Whitfield decided it was time for Martha to start producing the next generation of his property. He chose a man named Caesar, strong and healthy, good breeding stock. Martha was informed of the arrangement like it was any other work assignment. She would live with Caesar, bear his children, raise them until they were old enough to work. Caesar was kind as any man could be in their situation. He was gentle with her, tried to make their forced union something approaching love. When James was born, Caesar held him like he was made of gold, whispered promises about finding a way to buy their freedom, about giving their son a better life than they had known. But kindness could not change the fundamental reality of their existence. Their children were born slaves, property of Master Whitfield, subject to his will and his financial needs. When Caesar was killed in a farming accident, crushed under an overturned wagon when James was only 5, Martha understood that love was a luxury slaves could not afford. The overseers at Millfield were the worst kind of white trash, men who had nothing in the world except their authority over enslaved people and their determination to use that authority as cruelly as possible. They were led by Samuel Pike, a man who believed fear was the only effective management tool and pain the only lesson worth teaching. Pike had been hired by Master Whitfield specifically for his reputation with difficult slaves. He had learned his trade on the brutal sugar plantations of Louisiana, where enslaved people died so quickly that constant replacement was simply part of the business model. He brought those methods to Millfield, along with 5 assistants who shared his philosophy of management through terror. There was Jonas Fell, who liked to use his fists on women who moved too slowly or spoke too freely. Marcus Webb, who carried a knife and wasn't shy about using it to mark slaves who annoyed him. David Horn, who had a special hatred for enslaved children and found excuses to whip them for the smallest infractions. Thomas Burke, who enjoyed forcing enslaved people to beat each other for his entertainment. And Benjamin Cross, who was known for his creative punishments and his belief that breaking spirits was more important than breaking backs. These were the 6 men who had made Martha's life and the lives of her people a daily nightmare of violence and humiliation. 6 men who believed their white skin gave them the right to torture and terrorize 200 human beings for the crime of having been born with darker complexions. Martha had felt their fists, endured their insults, watched them brutalize her, friends and neighbors with casual indifference. She had seen Pike horsewhip an elderly man for stumbling while carrying cotton bales, had watched Fell beat a young woman unconscious for defending her daughter from unwanted attention, had witnessed Horn tie a 10-year-old boy to a tree and leave him in the sun all day for stealing an apple. But it was what they had done to her son James that finally pushed Martha beyond the point of endurance. 3 weeks before that fatal Sunday, Pike had decided that James was getting too rebellious, too willing to look white men in the eye, too quick to help other slaves who were struggling with their workloads. The punishment had been public, designed to send a message to the entire plantation. James had been stripped naked, tied to the whipping post in the center of the slave quarters, and beaten with a cat-o'-nine-tails until his back was hamburger and blood pooled in the dust around his feet. Martha had been forced to watch, held, in place by Horn and Burke while her son screamed for mercy that never came. When it was over, when James hung unconscious from his bonds, Pike had walked over to Martha and whispered in her ear, "That's what happens to uppity niggers who forget their place. You'd do well to remember that, Martha." 2 days later, James was sold. Pike claimed it was coincidence, just good business to get rid of a troublesome slave before he caused real problems. But Martha knew the truth. They had broken her son's spirit with the whip, then sold him to make sure she understood that resistance would always be punished, that love would always be used against her, that hope was a luxury she could not afford. That was when something inside Martha Cooper died, and something else was born to take its place. Something that did not fear death because it was already dead. Something that did not plead for mercy because it expected none. Something that understood that in a world built on violence, only violence could bring change. Sunday morning came gray and cool, with storm clouds building on the horizon like an omen. Martha woke before dawn as always, but today felt different. Today felt final, like the last page of a book she had been reading her entire life. She helped her mother dress, braided Sarah's hair, made sure Thomas's face was clean. Normal things, the same routine she had followed for years. But underneath the familiar actions, Martha was making different calculations. She was counting steps from her pew to the chapel's fireplace, measuring the distance between the overseer's seats and the door, remembering which man sat where, who was armed, who would be fastest to react. The call for assembly came at 7 o'clock sharp. Martha walked with her family across the plantation yard, past the cotton fields where she had spent the majority of her adult life, past the great house where she had served meals to people who owned her children, toward the small wooden chapel that had been built specifically to remind enslaved people of their place in God's grand design. The chapel was not large, perhaps 30 feet long and 20 feet wide, with rough wooden benches arranged in neat rows. A simple altar stood at the front, decorated with wildflowers that enslaved women were required to pick and arrange each Saturday evening. Above the altar hung a wooden cross, and below it sat a small table that served as the pulpit. The enslaved people filed in first, taking their designated seats in the back 3 rows of pews. Men on the left, women and children on the right, heads down, voices silent. Then came the white families, the master's relatives and guests, taking the front rows with the casual arrogance of people who had never questioned their right to the best of everything. Finally came the overseers, the 6 men who ruled the plantation, with whips and fists, and the absolute certainty that their authority came directly from God Himself. They sat in the middle rows, between the whites and the enslaved, literally and figuratively, occupying the space between heaven and hell. Pike sat closest to the aisle, his usual place of honor as head overseer. Fell was beside him, then Webb, then the others in their usual formation. All dressed in their Sunday best, all carrying themselves with the pompous dignity of men who believed their brutality was sanctified by Scripture. The service began as it always did, with hymns about submission and suffering, about finding joy in tribulation and accepting God's will without question. Martha sat in her usual place in the back row on the women's side, little Thomas pressed against her left side, Sarah on her right, her mother at the end of the pew. But today, Martha was not listening to the words. She was watching, counting, planning. The poker that heated the chapel's small fireplace was exactly where she remembered, hanging on a hook beside the hearth. The fireplace itself was only 10 feet from Pike's seat, close enough to reach in 3 quick steps. The preacher, a local white minister named Reverend Hayes, was in full swing, reading from Ephesians about servants obeying their masters with fear and trembling. His voice rose and fell with practiced rhythm, painting pictures of divine order and earthly hierarchy, of God blessing those who knew their place and cursing those who sought to rise above their station. Martha had heard this sermon 100 times before, or variations of it. Always the same message. Accept your suffering. Embrace your bondage. Find joy in your oppression. God had made some people to rule and others to serve, and questioning that order was questioning God himself. But today, something in the familiar words sparked a different kind of fire in Martha's chest. Today, she heard something else in the Scripture, something the preacher would never acknowledge. She heard about righteous anger, about justice rolling down like waters, about a God who freed slaves from bondage and struck down their oppressors with mighty power. Reverend Hayes was reading from Colossians now, about servants obeying their masters in all things, not just when being watched, but always, out of fear of the Lord. Pike and his men nodded along, their faces showing the satisfaction of men hearing their cruelty justified by Holy Writ. That was when Martha saw it. Horn was reaching over to pinch young Sarah's arm, hard enough to make her wince, but quietly enough not to disturb the service. It was a casual act of cruelty, meaningless to him but terrifying to an 8-year-old girl who had no way to defend herself. Martha felt the last of her restraint snap like an overtaxed rope. 15 years of accumulated rage, grief, and desperation rose up in her throat like bile. Her vision went red around the edges, and suddenly she was moving, rising from her seat with the fluid motion of a predator finally unleashed. She walked down the aisle toward the fireplace, her footsteps silent, on the wooden floor, her movement so natural and purposeful that no one immediately registered the danger. The poker was warm in her hands, solid iron forged for practical purpose, but perfect for the work she had in mind. Pike saw her first, turned his head just as Martha reached striking distance. His eyes widened as he realized what was happening, his mouth opening to shout a warning that never came. The poker caught him across the temple with a sound like an axe biting into green wood, and he dropped to the floor like a stone. The chapel erupted in chaos. Women screamed, men shouted, children cried. But Martha was already moving to her second target, the poker rising and falling with mechanical precision, driven by 15 years of suppressed fury and the desperate love of a mother who had lost. Everything that mattered, Fell tried to stand, tried to draw the knife he always carried, but Martha was faster, stronger, more desperate. The poker caught him in the face, crushing his nose and dropping him across the pew behind him. Blood sprayed across the wildflowers on the altar, turning their innocent beauty into something darker, more honest. Webb lunged at her from the side, his hands reaching for her throat, but Martha had spent 15 years hauling cotton bales and working plantation fields. Her arms were strong, her balance sure, her determination absolute. She spun away from his grasping fingers and brought the poker down on his skull with enough force to crack bone and silence his screaming forever. Horn and Burke tried to rush her together, thinking that 2 men could surely overpower one enslaved woman, even one who had clearly lost her mind. But Martha Cooper was not crazy. She was focused, precise, methodical in her violence. She had planned this moment in her dreams for weeks, had rehearsed every movement in the darkness of her cabin. Horn went down with his jaw hanging at an impossible angle, his knife spinning away across the floor to land at the feet of a terrified white child. Burke lasted longer, managed to land a punch that split Martha's lip and filled her mouth with blood. But pain was nothing new to Martha Cooper, and she used her familiarity with suffering the way a warrior uses a familiar weapon. The poker found Burke's ribs, his stomach, his throat. He fell beside his companions, his Sunday clothes soaking up his life as it drained away through wounds that no doctor could heal and no prayer could close. Cross was the last one standing, the youngest and fastest of the overseers, a man who had always prided himself on his quick reflexes and violent skills. He had his gun drawn, was bringing it to bear on Martha's chest, his finger tightening on the trigger of a weapon that had ended many rebellions before they could truly begin. But Martha was already inside his guard, the poker moving upward in a short vicious arc that caught him under the chin and snapped his head back like a rag doll's. The gun fired into the chapel ceiling, showering everyone with splinters and smoke, but Cross would never fire another shot at another human being. 6 men, 6 lives, 6 representatives of a system built on cruelty and sustained by violence, all dead in less than 10 minutes, all brought down by a woman who had finally decided that death was preferable to continued submission. Martha stood in the middle of the carnage, the poker still dripping in her hands, her blue dress splattered, with blood that was not her own. Around her, the chapel had gone silent except for the sound of weeping and the whispered prayers of people who had just witnessed the impossible. A slave had killed her masters. A woman had struck down 6 armed men. A mother had chosen vengeance over safety, violence over submission, death over dishonor. In a world where such things were literally unthinkable, Martha Cooper had thought the unthinkable and made it real. Master Whitfield himself was in the front row, his face pale with shock and something that might have been fear. The other white families huddled together like sheep sensing wolves, their usual arrogance replaced by the terrible understanding that their safety had always been an illusion, dependent on the continued willingness of their victims to accept victimization. The enslaved people sat frozen in their pews, caught between terror and something that might have been hope. They had just seen one of their own do what none of them had dared to dream. They had witnessed proof that their oppressors were not gods, that white skin did not confer immortality, that justice could take forms that did not depend on the approval of those who benefited from injustice. Martha looked around the chapel, at the faces of her people, at the bodies of her enemies, at the blood-soaked altar where so many lies had been preached in God's name. When she spoke, her voice was calm, steady, carrying clearly through the sudden silence. "They killed my boy," she said simply. "Sold him like a mule, broke his spirit with their whips, sent him to die in a place I'll never see. They would have done the same to Sarah, to Thomas, to all our children when their time came. Someone had to say no. Someone had to make them pay." She dropped the poker, let it clatter to the floor beside Pike's motionless body. "I ain't sorry for what I done. I ain't sorry they're dead. I'm only sorry it took me so long to find the courage." Martha walked back to her pew, sat down beside her children, put her arms around them like nothing had happened, like she had not just changed the course of history with 15 minutes of righteous violence, like she had not just proven that even the most oppressed could become oppressors when pushed beyond the breaking point. The silence stretched for another minute, 2 minutes, an eternity of held breath and racing hearts. Then Master Whitfield rose from his seat, his face a mask of rage and fear and the terrible knowledge that his world had just shifted on its axis. "Seize her," he commanded, but his voice cracked on the words, and none of the remaining white men moved to obey. They were staring at Martha like she was a dangerous animal, something that might strike again if provoked. Martha stood up slowly, gently pushing her children toward their grandmother. "Don't," she said quietly. "Don't touch them. This was my doing, my choice. They had no part in it." She walked toward the chapel door, her head high, her steps steady. At the threshold she paused and looked back at the scene she was leaving behind. 6 dead overseers, 200 enslaved people who would never again be able to pretend that resistance was impossible. A room full of white people who had just learned that their power was not absolute, their safety not guaranteed. Tell them, Martha said, addressing the enslaved people who sat watching her with wide eyes and open mouths. Tell them what you saw here today. Tell them that Martha Cooper said enough. Tell them that even we can fight back when we've got nothing left to lose. She walked out of the chapel into the gray morning light, leaving behind a silence that would echo through Georgia for decades to come. Behind her, the business of being shocked, of organizing pursuit, of restoring order would soon begin. But Martha Cooper was no longer interested in order, no longer concerned with consequences, no longer afraid of what white men might do to a black woman who had forgotten her place. She walked across the plantation yard, past the cotton fields, toward the swamp that bordered Millfield's eastern boundary. She had always known this day would come, had always known that her resistance would eventually cross the line from internal to external, from private to public, from thought to action. The dogs would come soon, and the horses, and the men with guns and ropes and the absolute determination to make her pay for what she had done. They would hunt her through the swamp like an animal, would track her down and kill her in the most painful way they could devise, would make her death an example to every other enslaved person who might be tempted to raise their hand against their oppressors. But Martha Cooper was not running toward freedom. She was not trying to escape to the north, was not hoping to find sanctuary among abolitionists or sympathetic Quakers. She was simply walking toward her death with dignity, choosing the time and manner of her final moments rather than allowing others to make that choice for her. She had killed 6 men who deserved killing. She had shown her people that resistance was possible, that their oppressors were mortal, that violence could flow both ways in a system built on violence. She had chosen her children's honor over their safety, their pride over their survival, their humanity over their bondage. It was enough. It was more than enough. It was everything. Martha heard the first dogs barking in the distance, heard the shouting of men organizing a hunt, heard the thunder of hooves as the pursuit began in earnest. She did not quicken her pace, did not look back, did not allow fear to taint the satisfaction that filled her chest like warm honey. She thought of James, sold away to suffer and die among strangers. She thought of Sarah and Thomas, who would grow up knowing that their mother had chosen death over dishonor, violence over submission, justice over safety. She thought of her own mother, who had taught her to read and write in secret, who had kept alive the memory of freedom even in the heart of bondage. Most of all, she thought of the looks on those 6 faces when they realized that Martha Cooper was no longer afraid of them, no longer willing to accept their cruelty as the natural order of the universe. The moment when they understood that their victim had become their executioner, that their property had reclaimed her humanity through the simple act of refusing to accept theirs. The dogs were closer now, their baying echoing through the trees like the voices of demons. But Martha was not afraid of demons. She had lived with them for 15 years, had served their meals and washed their clothes and borne their children, and listened to their justifications for evil. She had looked into the face of absolute power and found it wanting. She had stared down the barrel of systemic oppression and refused to blink. She had chosen violence over victimhood, action over acceptance, death over degradation. The swamp was dark and cool, filled with the sounds of hidden life and secret growth. Martha walked deeper into its embrace, leaving behind the world of cotton fields and whipping posts and Sunday sermons about divine order. She was going home, finally, to a place where no one could own her, where no one could hurt her children, where no one could make her bow her head and call brutality blessed. Behind her, the plantation was in chaos. The bodies of 6 overseers lay cooling in the chapel where they had gone to hear about their divine right to terrorize other human beings. 200 enslaved people were learning that resistance was possible, that their oppressors were mortal, that the system that held them in bondage was not ordained by God, but maintained by force. The hunt would continue for days, weeks, months. They would search every swamp in Georgia, would question every enslaved person on every plantation, would offer rewards and make threats and use every tool at their disposal to find Martha Cooper and make her pay for her rebellion. But they would never find her. Not because she had escaped, but because the woman they were looking for no longer existed. Martha Cooper, the slave, had died in that chapel the moment she picked up the poker and chose justice over safety. What walked into the Swamp was something else entirely, something they had no words for and no power over. The Martha Cooper who emerged from this story was not a victim, not property, not a cautionary tale about the dangers of uppity slaves getting ideas above their station. She was a force of nature, a reckoning, a reminder that every system of oppression contains the seeds of its own destruction. Her story spread through the slave quarters like wildfire, carried by whispers and coded songs and the kind of underground communication network that connected the oppressed across hundreds of miles and decades of silence. Martha Cooper, the woman who killed 6 overseers in God's house. Martha Cooper who chose death over dishonor. Martha Cooper who proved that even we can fight back when we've lost everything that matters. The white authorities tried to suppress the story, tried to convince people that it had never happened, that Martha Cooper was a myth, that slaves could not and would not and should not resist their proper place in the social order. But you cannot suppress truth with lies, cannot silence justice with propaganda, cannot kill an idea whose time has finally come. Martha's rebellion became legend, inspiration for countless others who found themselves facing impossible choices, between submission and resistance, between safety and dignity, between life and honor. Her name became a whispered prayer in slave cabins from Virginia to Texas, a reminder that even the most powerless had power, even the most oppressed could strike back, even the most broken could choose the manner of their breaking. The system of slavery was vast, powerful, seemingly eternal. It was supported by law and custom, by religion and politics, by economic necessity and racial ideology. It had survived rebellions before, had absorbed the anger of the oppressed and transformed it into even greater oppression, had used violence to justify more violence in an endless cycle of brutality and counter-brutality. But Martha Cooper had done something different. She had not led a rebellion, had not tried to overthrow the system, had not attempted to free her people through organized resistance. She had simply chosen her own death over continued life as property, had selected the time and place and manner of her final act of defiance. In doing so, she had shown that the system's power was not absolute, that its authority was not divine, that its victims could become agents of their own liberation, even if that liberation took the form of destruction rather than freedom. She had proven that every human being, no matter how oppressed, retained the ultimate power to say no. The 6 overseers who died in that chapel represented more than just 6 individual lives. They represented a way of thinking, a system of beliefs, a structure of power that depended on the continued willingness of its victims to accept victimization. Martha Cooper's refusal to continue accepting that victimization struck at the very heart of the system, challenged its fundamental assumptions, exposed its essential weakness. Slavery depended on the consent of the enslaved, even if that consent was obtained through violence and terror. It required its victims to internalize their oppression, to accept their degradation as natural and inevitable, to find ways to survive within the system rather than ways to destroy it. Martha Cooper's rebellion was dangerous, not because it killed 6 men, but because it demonstrated that such consent could be withdrawn, that such acceptance could be refused, that such survival could be rejected in favor of something more valuable. The story of Martha Cooper reminds us that resistance takes many forms, not all of them comfortable, not all of them politically correct, not all of them compatible with our modern sensibilities about violence and justice. Sometimes resistance means picking up a weapon and striking back against those who have struck you first. Sometimes justice means blood, means death, means the kind of reckoning that makes civilized people uncomfortable. Martha Cooper was not a saint. She was not a perfect victim or a noble savage or a symbol of anything except her own refusal to continue accepting the unacceptable. She was a human being pushed beyond the limits of human endurance, a mother whose child had been stolen, a woman whose dignity had been systematically destroyed by people who believed their skin color gave them the right to play God with other people's lives. Her response to that treatment was not measured, not proportionate, not designed to win sympathy from those who might judge her actions from the comfort of their own freedom. Her response was human, raw, final. It was the response of someone who had finally decided that death was preferable to dishonor, that violence was better than continued victimization, that justice mattered more than safety. In our own time, when we face different but related forms of oppression and injustice, Martha Cooper's story challenges us to think honestly about resistance, about the limits of patience, about the point at which accommodation becomes collaboration. It asks uncomfortable questions about the nature of justice, the role of violence in social change, the responsibility of the oppressed to resist their oppression. Most importantly, it reminds us that every system of power, no matter how vast or entrenched, depends ultimately on the consent of those it governs. When that consent is withdrawn, when that cooperation is refused, when that acceptance is replaced by active resistance, even the most powerful systems can be shaken to their foundations. Martha Cooper shook the foundations of slavery not through organizing or preaching or writing, but through the simple act of refusing to accept what had been done to her and her family. Her refusal was violent, final, costly, but it was also effective, inspiring, transformative. She died as she chose to die, on her own terms, with her dignity intact and her resistance complete. She left behind children who would grow up knowing that their mother had chosen honor over safety, that she had refused to bow down to those who claimed ownership over her soul. She left behind a community that had seen with their own eyes that their oppressors were mortal, that resistance was possible, that even they could fight back when they had nothing left to lose. Most importantly, she left behind a story that continues to inspire and challenge more than 180 years later. A story that reminds us that individual acts of courage can change the course of history, that even the most powerless have power, that love and rage and desperate hope can move mountains when they are channeled in the right direction at the right time. Martha Cooper's rebellion lasted only minutes, but its effects rippled through decades. Her choice to fight back rather than continue submitting helped plant seeds that would eventually grow into the abolition movement, the Civil War, the end of slavery itself. Not because her actions directly caused those larger changes, but because her example helped convince both the oppressed and their allies that the system could be challenged, that its victims could become agents of their own liberation. That change was possible even when it seemed impossible. The chapel at Millfield Plantation was never used for services again after that bloody Sunday in 1834. Master Whitfield had it torn down within a week, the blood-stained wood burned and the ashes scattered in the fields where Martha had once worked. But destroying the building could not erase what had happened within its walls, could not silence the whispers that spread from plantation to plantation like wildfire in dry grass. Chatir. Story grew in the telling, as stories do. Martha Cooper became Martha the Avenger, the Black Angel of Death, the woman who would not bow. Details were added, embellished, transformed by the needs of those who told and retold her tale. But at the heart of every version was the same simple truth. An enslaved woman had chosen death over dishonor, violence over submission, justice over safety. The Martha Coop. The authorities tried everything to suppress the story. Rewards were offered for information about Martha's whereabouts, though her body was never found in the swamps where she had disappeared. Laws were passed, making it illegal to speak of slave rebellions, even failed ones. Preachers were instructed to emphasize obedience and submission even more forcefully in their Sunday sermons. But you cannot kill an idea whose time has come, cannot silence a truth that resonates in the hearts of the oppressed. Martha's story survived in coded spirituals sung in the fields, in whispered conversations in slave cabins, in the determined silence of those who refused to betray her memory to their master's questions. The impact on Millfield itself was immediate and devastating. Within 6 months of Martha's rebellion, Master Whitfield had sold the plantation and moved his family to Charleston, claiming that the land had become cursed, that the very soil cried out with the voices of the dead. The new overseer he had hired to replace the 6 Martha had killed lasted less than a month before fleeing in the night, claiming that he heard voices in the wind and saw shadows moving where no shadows should be. The enslaved people who remained at Millfield were changed by what they had witnessed. They worked more slowly, spoke more boldly, met their new overseer's eyes with a directness that made grown men uncomfortable. They had seen one of their own refuse to accept the unacceptable, had watched her choose dignity over survival, had witnessed proof that their oppressors were mortal. Sarah and Thomas, Martha's surviving children, were sold separately to different plantations within the year. Master Whitfield claimed it was for their own protection, that keeping them together would only remind people of their mother's crimes. But the truth was simpler and more brutal. He was afraid of them. Afraid that Martha's rebellion might be hereditary, that her children might carry within them the same refusal to accept oppression that had made their mother so dangerous. Sarah was bought by a rice plantation owner in South Carolina, who believed that separating troublesome families was the key to preventing future rebellions. She was 8 years old when she last saw her brother, old enough to remember her mother's face in those final moments in the chapel, old enough to understand that Martha Cooper had chosen to die rather than watch her children grow up in bondage. Sarah carried that knowledge with her through 15 years of slavery, through the whippings and the forced breeding, and the daily humiliations that were the lot of enslaved women in the antebellum South. She never spoke of her mother to her new owners, never acknowledged that she was Martha Cooper's daughter, but she never forgot the lesson Martha had taught her, that dignity was worth more than safety, that some things were worth dying for, that even slaves could choose how their story would end. When the Civil War began in 1861, Sarah was 23 years old and the mother of 3 children whose fathers she had not been allowed to choose. She was working as a house servant on the Beaumont plantation near Charleston, trusted enough to serve at the master's table but watched carefully enough that escape was impossible. But as Union forces moved through South Carolina in 1865, as the sound of artillery grew closer and the certainty of Confederate defeat became undeniable, Sarah found herself facing the same choice her mother had confronted 30 years earlier: submit or resist, survive or fight back, accept oppression or choose freedom even at the cost of everything else. The Beaumont family was preparing to flee Charleston, to take their most valuable property with them deeper into the Confederate interior, where slavery might survive the approaching Union victory. Sarah was on the list of slaves to be evacuated, along with her children and 20 other enslaved people whose labor and skills made them too valuable to lose. The night before the planned departure, Sarah stood in the kitchen of the great house, where she had worked for 15 years, holding a carving knife and thinking of her mother. Outside, she could hear the distant sound of Union artillery, the sound of freedom approaching like thunder on the horizon. Inside, she could hear the Beaumont family packing their valuables, preparing to run deeper into a world where human beings could still be bought and sold. She thought of Martha Cooper, standing in that chapel with a bloody poker in her hands, choosing death over dishonor. She thought of the look in her mother's eyes in those final moments, the peace that came with finally saying no to the unacceptable. She thought of her own children, asleep in the quarters, who would grow up free if the Union won but might spend the rest of their lives in bondage if the Confederacy somehow survived. Sarah Cooper made her choice, but unlike her mother, she chose life over death, escape over confrontation, hope over despair. When the Beaumont family woke the next morning, they found their house empty of slaves. Their most valuable property vanished in the night like morning mist. Sarah had led all 21 enslaved people through the swamps toward the Union lines, carrying her youngest child and guiding the others through paths she had learned in childhood, routes Martha had shown her during those brief years before the rebellion that changed everything. It was not the same kind of resistance her mother had chosen, but it was resistance nonetheless, a refusal to accept transportation deeper into bondage when freedom was so close they could hear its artillery. They reached Union forces 3 days later, dirty and hungry but free, part of the great exodus of enslaved people who voted with their feet for the end of slavery. Sarah never looked back, never returned to the plantation where she had spent most of her life, never spoke to white people about her past, except to say that her name was Sarah Cooper and she was done being anyone's property. Thomas, Martha's son, had a different war. Sold to a plantation in Mississippi at age 8, he grew up hard and angry, carrying his mother's rage like a coal in his chest that never stopped burning. He was 23 when the war began, a field hand whose intelligence and literacy had been carefully hidden from overseers who might see education as a sign of potential rebellion. When Union forces moved through Mississippi, Thomas did not wait for liberation to come to him. He slipped away from the plantation in the dark of night, making his way to Union lines where he volunteered for one of the colored regiments being formed from escaped slaves and free black men from the North. Thomas Cooper fought in 17 battles during his 3 years of military service, from Milliken's Bend to the final assault on Petersburg. He carried his mother's memory into every fight, thinking of Martha Cooper every time he fixed bayonet and charged Confederate positions, every time he pulled the trigger on men who looked like his former masters. He was not fighting just for the Union, not just for the end of slavery, not just for his own freedom. He was fighting for Martha Cooper, for the woman who had shown him that resistance was possible, that oppression could be fought, that dignity was worth any sacrifice. Every Confederate soldier who fell to his rifle was a small payment on the debt the South owed to his mother's memory. Thomas survived the war, one of the nearly 200,000 African American men who served in Union forces and helped win the victory that ended slavery forever. He settled in Philadelphia after the war, the same city where Martha and Samuel had built their secret life 30 years earlier, though Thomas never knew that part of his family's history. He married a woman named Grace, a former house slave from Virginia, who had also made her way north during the war. Together they had 6 children, all born free, all educated, all raised on stories of resistance and rebellion, and the refusal to accept injustice as inevitable. Thomas lived until 1923, long enough to see his grandchildren attend integrated schools, long enough to witness the beginning of the Great Migration that would reshape American society, long enough to understand that his mother's rebellion had been part of something larger, a long arc of resistance that had finally bent toward justice. In his final years, Thomas would sit on his porch in Philadelphia and tell stories to neighborhood children about the grandmother they had never met, the woman who had chosen death over dishonor in a chapel in Georgia nearly a century earlier. He never mentioned the violence, never spoke of the blood or the bodies or the poker that had delivered Martha's justice. Instead, he spoke of courage, of a woman who had loved her children too much to watch them grow up in chains, of the choice between submission and resistance that every generation must make in its own way. He spoke of Martha Cooper not as a killer, but as a liberator, not as a criminal, but as a hero, not as a cautionary tale, but as an inspiration. The children who heard those stories grew up to be teachers and preachers, doctors and lawyers, activists and artists. They carried Martha's memory forward into the civil rights movement of the 1950s and 60s, into the struggles for equality and justice that continue to this day. Her spirit lived on in every sit-in and freedom ride, every march and protest, every moment when ordinary people chose to resist injustice rather than accept it. The Martha Cooper who emerged from this story was not a victim, not property, not a cautionary tale about the dangers of uppity slaves getting ideas above their station. She was a force of nature, a reckoning, a reminder that every system of oppression contains the seeds of its own destruction. Her story spread through the slave quarters like wildfire, carried by whispers and coded songs and the kind of underground communication network that connected the oppressed across hundreds of miles and decades of silence. Martha Cooper, the woman who killed 6 overseers in God's house. Martha Cooper who chose death over dishonor. Martha Cooper who proved that even we can fight back when we've lost everything that matters. The white authorities tried to suppress the story, tried to convince people that it had never happened, that Martha Cooper was a myth, that slaves could not and would not and should not resist their proper place in the social order. But you cannot suppress truth with lies, cannot silence justice with propaganda, cannot kill an idea whose time has finally come. Martha's rebellion became legend, inspiration for countless others who found themselves facing impossible choices, between submission and resistance, between safety and dignity, between life and honor. Her name became a whispered prayer in slave cabins from Virginia to Texas, a reminder that even the most powerless had power, even the most oppressed could strike back, even the most broken could choose the manner of their breaking. The system of slavery was vast, powerful, seemingly eternal. It was supported by law and custom, by religion and politics, by economic necessity and racial ideology. It had survived rebellions before, had absorbed the anger of the oppressed and transformed it into even greater oppression, had used violence, to justify more violence in an endless cycle of brutality and counter-brutality. But Martha Cooper had done something different. She had not led a rebellion, had not tried to overthrow the system, had not attempted to free her people through organized resistance. She had simply chosen her own death over continued life as property, had selected the time and place and manner of her final act of defiance. In doing so, she had shown that the system's power was not absolute, that its authority was not divine, that its victims could become agents of their own liberation, even if that liberation took the form of destruction rather than freedom. She had proven that every human being, no matter how oppressed, retained the ultimate power to say no. The 6 overseers who died in that chapel represented more than just 6 individual lives. They represented a way of thinking, a system of beliefs, a structure of power that depended on the continued willingness of its victims to accept victimization. Martha Cooper's refusal to continue accepting that victimization struck at the very heart of the system, challenged its fundamental assumptions, exposed its essential weakness. Slavery depended on the consent of the enslaved, even if that consent was obtained through violence and terror. It required its victims to internalize their oppression, to accept their degradation as natural and inevitable, to find ways to survive within the system rather than ways to destroy it. Martha Cooper's rebellion was dangerous, not because it killed 6 men, but because it demonstrated that such consent could be withdrawn, that such acceptance could be refused, that such survival could be rejected in favor of something more valuable. The story of Martha Cooper reminds us that resistance takes many forms, not all of them comfortable, not all of them politically correct, not all of them compatible with our modern sensibilities about violence and justice. Sometimes resistance means picking up a weapon and striking back against those who have struck you first. Sometimes justice means blood, means death, means the kind of reckoning that makes civilized people uncomfortable. Martha Cooper was not a saint. She was not a perfect victim or a noble savage or a symbol of anything except her own refusal to continue accepting the unacceptable. She was a human being pushed beyond the limits of human endurance, a mother whose child had been stolen, a woman whose dignity had been systematically destroyed by people who believed their skin color gave them the right to play God with other people's lives. Her response to that treatment was not measured, not proportionate, not designed to win sympathy from those who might judge her actions from the comfort of their own freedom. Her response was human, raw, final. It was the response of someone who had finally decided that death was preferable to dishonor, that violence was better than continued victimization, that justice mattered more than safety. In our own time, when we face different but related forms of oppression and injustice, Martha Cooper's story challenges us to think honestly about resistance, about the limits of patience, about the point at which accommodation becomes collaboration. It asks uncomfortable questions about the nature of justice, the role of violence in social change, the responsibility of the oppressed to resist their oppression. Most importantly, it reminds us that every system of power, no matter how vast or entrenched, depends ultimately on the consent of those it governs. When that consent is withdrawn, when that cooperation is refused, when that acceptance is replaced by active resistance, even the most powerful systems can be shaken to their foundations. Martha Cooper shook the foundations of slavery not through organizing or preaching or writing, but through the simple act of refusing to accept what had been done to her and her family. Her refusal was violent, final, costly, but it was also effective, inspiring, transformative. She died as she chose to die on her own terms, with her dignity intact and her resistance complete. She left behind children who would grow up knowing that their mother had chosen honor over safety, that she had refused to bow down to those who claimed ownership over her soul. She left behind a community that had seen with their own eyes that their oppressors were mortal, that resistance was possible, that even they could fight back when they had nothing left to lose. Most importantly, she left behind a story that continues to inspire and challenge more than 180 years later. A story that reminds us that individual acts of courage can change the course of history, that even the most powerless have power, that love and rage and desperate hope can move mountains when they are channeled in the right direction at the right time. Martha Cooper's rebellion lasted only minutes, but its effects rippled through decades. Her choice to fight back rather than continue submitting helped plant seeds that would eventually grow into the abolition movement, the Civil War, the end of slavery itself. Not because her actions directly caused those larger changes, but because her example helped convince both the oppressed and their allies that the system could be challenged, that its victims could become agents of their own liberation. That change was possible even when it seemed impossible. The chapel at Millfield Plantation was never used for services again after that bloody Sunday in 1834. Master Whitfield had it torn down within a week. The blood-stained wood burned and the ashes scattered in the fields where Martha had once worked. But destroying the building could not erase what had happened within its walls, could not silence the whispers that spread from plantation to plantation like wildfire in dry grass. Chapter. Story grew in the telling, as stories do. Martha Cooper became Martha the Avenger, the Black Angel of Death, the woman who would not bow. Details were added, embellished, transformed by the needs of those who told and retold her tale. But at the heart of every version was the same simple truth. An enslaved woman had chosen death over dishonor, violence over submission, justice over safety.